Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Stacy Owen. I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Engagement for the School of Business. Today's session is sponsored by the Legacy Center for Leadership and Character, and it is entitled Enterprise Leadership, the 6 Key Functions of Strategic Leadership. It will be facilitated by Dr. Sean Hanna, who is the Tylee Wilson Chair at the School of Business. We are recording this session. We will send out the recording and some of the notes later today to all of our attendees. Sean, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Stacy, and good morning, everybody. It's still, well, not morning anymore, I guess. It's turned afternoon, but it's good to see everybody. As Stacy said, I'm Sean Hanna, and please call me Sean today. She said I hold a chair here at the School of Business. I've been at the School of Business since 2012, so just passed my 12th year here recently. Just tell you a little bit about myself. I spent most of my life in the United States Army, so I did about 30 years in the Army. I retired in 2012, right before I came here as a colonel. You can see some of the operations I was involved in up on the screen there, everything from the Cold War, Desert Storm, Los Angeles riots, the Cuban boat lift crisis over in Panama, and then Cuba. Served in the Pentagon on 9/11 and had the responsibility to rebuild the organization that had the direct hit in the attack in the aftermath of that. And then I transitioned from being an infantry officer to come to West Point. So the Army sent me off to get my PhD in leadership development and sent me off to West Point, where I was the director of leadership and management programs, and then stood up an Army-wide center called the Center for the Army Profession and Ethics that was responsible for building character-based leaders across the Army. As I mentioned, I retired in 2012, came down here and stood up what is now the Legacy Center for Leadership and Character as the founding director of that. I teach in our MBA programs, and that's pretty much it. Teach leadership here, do a lot of research and all that. But enough about me. That's one you kind of know who's yakking at you here a little bit. So I am a scholar, but I do have 30 years of leadership experience. I've led up to 11,000 reports and direct reports and sphere of influence during my career. So today I'm going to talk about enterprise and strategic leadership. So in my parlance, coming from the military, we talk about the tactical, operational, strategic levels of any organization. And that language is actually being used a lot now in business writings too. The tactical levels where all the work really gets done. Those are the people that are actually producing products, services. They're touching customers, whether they're internal or external customers, but they're the ones who are actually doing the work. And then you've got that layer in the middle, that operational level, where leaders at that level are taking the guidance, the vision, and the strategies that are coming down from the strategic levels and operationalizing them, putting them into operation and putting guidance down to the tactical level, resources down to the tactical level. So that operational level is kind of the transition point, or you might say a translation point of making sure that all the strategic level stuff is getting pushed down throughout the organization. Everybody on this video here knows very well that sometimes it's not seamless going up and down this span here, that there's a lot of friction sometimes, a lot of lack of communication and lack of alignment, etc. But in a perfect world, we've got this nice cascading and translation down the scope here. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about today when I talk about strategic or enterprise leadership, I'm not talking about a position. When people hear that word, they tend to immediately think, oh, it's the C-suite of the organization, whatever. Well, no, enterprise leadership is a function. It's a set of behaviors and actions that can be done by leaders at different levels. And a matter of fact, a lot of the people that wear strategic hats from a formal position, they also have the dual purpose as an operational leader. So you might be the chief human resource officer for a company, and you're leading the human resource function at the operational level, but you're also sitting on the C-suite and are a senior leader of your organizational senior leadership team. And so you got to put on that strategic hat and flop back and forth between leading your own function and then tying your function into the broader strategic fabric of the organization. So part of it's a mindset that you see yourself as a leader, that's an enterprise leader, that's not just focusing on your area of the business, whether you're at tactical, operational, or strategic level, that you're the type of leader that wants to see the big picture, help integrate your work into the big picture, and of course, be a team player, right? Being able to work horizontally with others for what's best for the entire enterprise. So if you have that mindset and you contribute to the enterprise leadership functions that I'm about ready to show you next, you are an enterprise leader. And so we have to think then about, what type of skills do we need to have? What kind of a bench do we need to build in our organizations? Because there's different types of skills. You got technical and structural type of skills, or conceptual skills and symbolic skills, the ability to create plans and visions and to symbolize the future and to even conceptualize what's going on in the internal and external environment and be able to make sense and understanding for everybody in the organization. Of course, human skills, and then also political skills. Every single organization has political ongoings, and it's naive to think that we don't. Every organization has limited resources, and therefore we have to negotiate with each other. We have to champion ideas. There's going to be some winners. There's going to be some losers based off of people's wants and needs and desires in organizations. So particularly as you move up toward more of an enterprise leadership role, a more formal role, you've got to build a lot of political skills. So down toward the tactical level, we need a lot more technical and structural skills to actually get work done. Whereas as you go further and further up, the conceptual skills become extremely important, and the political skills. The human skills, of course, you need at every level, because I don't care who you are, you've got to be able to span this entire span. Even the CEO of a company, a Fortune 500 company, has to be a tactical level leader, because guess what? They have their own small team. They have their C-suite team that they are the leader of, no different than any frontline supervisor down on the shop floor has got their 6 or 8 employees and they're a frontline supervisor. So all of those frontline leadership skills, like creating cohesion, creating trust, in the team, creating processes and systems internal to the team, all that has to be done by leaders at every single level. So here's the primary definition of strategic leadership that we often see in the literature. It's a person's ability to anticipate and envision the future and maintain a flexible mindset. Really think strategically about what's changing around us. What are those forces that are shaping our environment? And how do we need to shape ourselves to fit strategically within that environment? What kind of capabilities do we need? What kind of core competencies do we need in that emerging future environment? And then, as it says, then work with others to initiate the changes to make that happen, to create that viable future for the organization within that evolving context that we have to compete within. So strategic leadership has sort of 2 aspects. If you read that definition, the first part of that is more of the cognitive part, right? It's the ability to think, envision, have that flexible mindset, don't be rigid, be able to conceptualize the future and what we need to do in the company. But the second part is more about leadership. It's about working with a diverse group of individuals in an organization and getting everybody aligned horizontally and vertically to actually pursue and achieve that new vision for the future and lead organizational change to make it happen. But again, as it says on the box there, I want to just keep reinforcing that strategic leadership is a process, not a position. Right? If you look at that definition, it doesn't say, the CEO's ability, right? It says a person's ability. And so we can be a strategic leader with a strategic enterprise mindset at any level of the organization. So I don't know if you've all seen this statistic here, but every time I do, it kind of blows me away. These are the Fortune 500, right? These are the largest firms. These are the firms that have just, huge amounts of resources, huge amount of brand recognition. They've got entire systems of stakeholders that are supporting these organizations. And even then, with all of those capabilities and brand recognition and everything else, are having trouble surviving. Now, if you look, I was born pretty much to the far left of this chart here, and I think about just in my lifetime alone, the average firm went from lasting over 60 years on the Fortune 500 list to now it's down to about 11, which is pretty crazy, right? That doesn't mean they all went bankrupt. Some of them went bankrupt. Some of them became weak and got gobbled up by other companies through mergers and acquisitions. And some of them just simply fell out of the top 500 firms because their products and services or their value pricing or something just no longer fit within the market needs and the market demands out there. And so, we have to ask ourselves, well, why is this, right? And some of it, of course, is just VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments that we're living in now, with a lot of speed of technological revolution. There's a lot of social political change. There's a lot of things that are going on that are changing customer demands and everything else. But again, we expect those things to change around us. And so, as I just talked about the definition of enterprise leadership, if people are doing that well and they're spending adequate time and are competent in forecasting the future and thinking about a viable future for the company and working with people to make it happen, then you can survive a lot better in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. So I would say in many ways, a lot of this I think is indicative of failure of people to truly practice enterprise leadership versus focusing on the here and now, short term. How are we going to make the monthly numbers, the quarterly numbers, whatever it may be, and spend time kind of looking over the horizon. So I'm about ready to share with you 6 major functions of enterprise leadership. Before I do that, though, I've been yakking for a few minutes here. Let me just stop and see what you guys think. Does anybody have any reactions or anything you'd like to share with the group or any questions? Let me hear at least one. Hopefully I'm creating some sort of neurological activity in you all. So tell me what's on your mind. All right. Are you all even out there? I don't see a lot of cameras on, so I feel like I'm talking to an echo chamber here, except for Carrie and then the Wake Forest team here. I would appreciate if you don't mind coming on camera because it helps me to see your faces and engage with you a little bit more. All right, so let me go ahead and go on then, and I'll talk about these 6 functions of enterprise leadership. Now, after our talk today, the team is going to send you a short, I think it's about a 6-page article that talks about these 6 functions. So you'll have that as a takeaway. You can read a little bit deeper on it. So since we just have a short time together, I'll just quickly go over these. This was a short paper I put together because I just couldn't find anything out there that I felt, particularly as an experienced strategic leader myself, that really encapsulated in a parsimonious model, really what are the most important functions of enterprise leadership. Again, these can be done by people of multiple layers of the organization. Again, it doesn't have to be done by just the top, but certainly at the top, these are absolutely critical. Everybody else, though, should be contributing to these. The first is focusing the organization attention. Where are we going? What are we doing? And why are we doing it? And when you talk about where we're going and what we're doing, it's really important to talk about what we're not going to do anymore, right? If you have an organization that is like most organizations nowadays, that you've already streamlined it down. It's extremely efficient team. You probably cut out a lot of the excess and the fat out of your organizations. Well, every time we say we're going to do something new, we need to then assume that we got to probably identify something we're not going to do, because the organization otherwise will just run out of capacity and people won't be able to focus on the priorities because they think everything's important. It's a job of leaders to make sure everybody understands this is where we're spending our time and here's some areas we're not in. And so set those priorities, set the vision and the mission, and then just remove distractions from everybody so that they can focus on what's most important. Now that upper left box is the most important because all the other boxes kind of feed off of that. So once we know where we're going, we focus the organization attention. Then the next question for enterprise leaders is, what capability set do we need to get there? Where do we need to make strategic investments, whether it's human capital, financial capital, you name it. What kind of core competencies do we need to build that are truly world-class and are going to be better than anybody else could bring to bear? What do we need as far as facilities, technology, materials, whatever? One of the important capabilities to build, that last point there, is build the adaptability capacity in your team, right? That in itself is a capacity. Have you built a team or an organization that is flexible and able to adapt to a changing future? Well, once we do refocus the organization's attention, there's always going to be tensions, right? Because we're going to have tensions over resource trade-offs as we change to new priorities. We've got to spend time thinking about inward versus outward focus, as it says there under reconciling the tension. How much time are we going to spend looking internal to our company and building our capability sets, our culture, our processes, our systems, whatever it might be, versus spending time looking outward of what's happening out there in our external environment and conducting research and gaining that understanding about what's happening around us. You obviously got to do both, but you got to determine how much time do you want to spend on each. It'll talk about it more in the reading, but this idea of exploration versus exploitation is another tension senior leaders have to kind of pull the lever on, right? Because when we're exploring new products and services, new green fields. We're trying out new processes, systems, whatever. When we're exploiting what we're already good at. And so all companies have to exploit their current products and services because that's where cash comes from, right? And we got to decide how much time are we going to spend continuing to do what we're doing very well and making cash on versus how much time we want to spend exploring new products, new services, new ways of doing business, new markets, whatever it might be. And there's a tension there because you got to decide where to put your resources, toward exploration or toward exploiting current capabilities. Now, obviously, you can get that wrong, right? We can continue to exploit our core capabilities until we become Kodak, right? Best film manufacturer in the world, but they didn't get on the digital bandwagon fast enough, but they kept exploiting. Obviously, if we know where we're going, we've already focused the organization's attention. We got to decide, okay, what kind of culture do we need? What kind of bench do we need of leaders and employees? It takes years, right, to build culture. It takes 3 to 5 years to change culture meaningfully. It takes years to develop people. We've got to have a strategic human resource plan that's aligned with our vision and our mission and our strategy. And that, again, is why we have to look years out, because it takes years to build culture. It takes years to build the bench. And then, of course, horizontal and vertical alignment. When I do consulting, this is one of the main things that companies talk about that they have problems with, right? Silos, fiefdoms, right? People aren't talking horizontally. And often I find it's because the senior leaders are not spending the time to make sure that there's a clear leader's intent, that everybody understands what we're doing, where we're going, what's important, which goes back again to the upper left bullet. And then make sure that we are, through both inspirational means, but also through more transactional means, aligning everything, right? Making sure that rewards and incentives and accountability mechanisms all support the bigger picture and the bigger strategy and the cross-functional behavior that you want to see, versus rewarding everybody for doing their jobs really well in their lanes. But I find pretty much every company I work with, they are incentivizing, rewarding, and holding people accountable for their swim lane. Well, and then they sit there and lament why we don't have people crossing swim lanes. It's like, well, because you are removed, you are not incentivizing them. So I don't know if any of you have ever read that book, Who Moved My Cheese? But anytime you want to align people, you got to move their cheese, right? People will go and find their cheese, and you put their cheese where you want their behavior to align. By cheese, I mean rewards and incentives and all. But anyways, and then just create that unity of effort. Somebody's got to be in charge of every task, every mission. You got to make sure that every cross-functional team truly has a leader that is responsible for the entire effort, is responsible for synchronization across all of the multifunctional task forces and everything else that you guys create in these cross-functional teams. And then lastly, leaders have to lead externally. Enterprise leaders need to be the face of the organization, carrying the brand, making sure we're symbolically speaking to the world. We're working with board relationships, the media, Wall Street, whatever it is, working with the big strategic customers and supply chain members and all of that, and just making sure that everybody outside the organization knows what the organization is doing, why it's doing it, and communicating the key messaging points that need to be communicated. So I know it's a lot. You're going to get the reading. We'll burrow down on these. I just want to kind of whet your appetite. But these are the things that if particularly senior leaders are not doing in an organization, they're just not getting done, right? Because nobody else hardly will be doing these if the senior leaders aren't focused on these. And but yet again, anybody can contribute to these. And in fact, you can take this same 6 and talk about it at the operation, because even within a function, you got to focus the function's attention. You got to reconcile tensions. You got to build the culture and bench in your function. You got to build the capabilities in your function. So it's not like these functions are reside only at that strategic level, but they certainly have to be done at that level, or the entire organization is going to suffer. All right, let me stop again, and I'm going to give you an example from Procter & Gamble here next, but get your thoughts and questions about the 6-factor model. Well, it's going to be a long hour. Work with me, guys. This is the audience participation part of the afternoon.
Sean, can I have a quick question?
Yeah, please.
From with all the factors that you just mentioned, there's certain external factor that like a leader have no control over, like political environment or the climate change, and with what like just happened recently with the pandemic. So how a leader can kind of like gather all of those to the level where they can control to, how you say it, mitigate the level of the risk or the damage to their company or business?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, obviously leaders can't foresee everything, right? The question is, how are you providing adequate time and effort toward not just you, but members of your team, right? Because leaders don't have to do everything themselves. You can actually assign different members of your team to monitor certain aspects of the external environment, right? Then they bring those back to team meetings once a month or something like that. But regardless of who's doing it, we want to look out the best we can to assess the future and prepare for that. And that's why under build capabilities, it talks about building organization adaptive capacity. Because regardless, you're never going to be able to see or forecast everything, COVID or whatever it might be. But if we spend time building the capability for our team to adapt, meaning having, building adaptive mindsets, adaptive processes, adaptive services, whatever it might be, we can react a lot quicker to those things. The other thing is there's a process called red teaming that you all might be interested in. I wrote an article for Chief Executive Magazine on red teaming. You can Google, you just type in my name, Chief Executive Magazine, red teaming, it'll pop up. But it's an article that I wrote for senior strategic leaders to understand like how the military does contingency planning and how we forecast the future, and translate that to senior business leaders. That might be worth looking at because that explains kind of how to actually do that sort of forecasting and contingency planning. Others? All right, well, let me give you an example from Procter & Gamble on this a little bit. It might bring it to life a little bit. And this really has to do predominantly, largely that upper left first tier is this idea of focusing the organization's attention. When Alan Lafley came to take over Procter & Gamble back in 2014, I heard him speak about this one time. He went into his first C-suite meeting as the new CEO, and everybody had all these briefings, and they were trying to just kill him with information to try to brief him up as the new CEO. And he kind of just stopped and said, "All right, look, cut to the chase here. Tell me where we make our money in this." And he was shocked because nobody was able to give him a consistent overall picture of the entire company and where the real profits come from the company. So he kicked them all out and said, "All right, I think he gave him 2 weeks or something. He said, I want a full briefing with, full activity-based costing, meaning burden all the overhead costs to all of our products, all of our services, so that we're truly reflecting all the costs associated with everything we do. And tell me where we're making money." And when they came back, they told him out of the 165 brands that Procter & Gamble had, that only 65 of those were contributing 90% of the firm's profits. Now, when you talk about a brand at Procter & Gamble, you're actually talking about like almost companies in themselves, right? That's like Crest toothpaste, Dove soap, And so these have their own marketing division. They have their own production division, factories and supply chain lines, and all of that. So you think about all of that effort the company is doing on 100 of these brands that are only making 10% of the firm's profits. And so he said, all right, we got to get focused here, right? We got to focus this organization on what's most important to us and where we could really be successful in the future. And what he did is he created 2 what we call like lines of operation. I'm not going to get too detailed on this slide because this would really be more where we would talk about developing strategy. But what he told everybody in the company is we have 2 different decisive lines of effort that we're going to focus on, or lines of operation. One of them he called the hygiene and personal care, and the other one was consumer health. And they loaded all the 65 remaining brands that we're going to focus on into these 2 and said, this is where we're going to double down. This is where we're going to put our focus. And you got to imagine, like before this, they sold stuff like Pringles potato chips, right? There was just all these weird product lines that were totally disconnected, and nobody in the company was able to really communicate who we are, where we're going, what we're focused on, and be able to communicate that externally too. So by putting all this emphasis, everybody clearly understood who we are as a company now, where our priorities are going to be: hygiene and personal care and consumer health. Those are very consistent with one another and allow them to really tell the story and to be able to focus all the organization's resources and all that. So on the left, they reassess what are all of our core key competencies or capabilities, resources that we have available, and then how are we going to leverage those across these decisive lines of operation to be able to achieve the vision that he laid out for the company after that. And then, of course, then they had to decide how they're going to shape the environment for these 2 to be successful. So a lot of other activities were not decisive. They were not the most important strategic thrusts of the company, but they were a lot of things that had to be done, whether it's through working with government affairs, because a lot of these are regulated products, new marketing, corporate social responsibility, creating new strategic alliances around these 2 decisive lines of operations. They did some mergers and acquisitions to further support these 2 thrusts now that they have identified them, and then created a series of sustaining activities or operations. Now that they knew where they were going to focus on these 2 lines, then they could really get a lot more clear on what investments do we need to make in technology, R&D, capital investments, et cetera, et cetera. What kind of new logistics do we need in our supply chain to support these 2 new lines of operation? Where do we need to give training and development? A lot of people's jobs had to be repurposed as they shut down product lines and focused on new ones. So there was a lot of, I say SHRM, strategic human resource management, and of course, training and development. So when you think about what he had to do with the company, I've talked a lot already about focusing the organization's attention there around what is now most important to them. And again, deciding what we're not going to do. We're not doing these other 100 brands. They're not providing enough bang for the buck or return on investments. When he did this, there was massive shifts in the company on resources and priorities. They had to spend a lot more time shifting toward an outward focus for a while. They had to really talk to the community out there about what they're doing and creating those new strategic relationships and all that, which also taps into leading externally. I mean, you can imagine, as one of the largest publicly traded companies, they had to communicate to make sure everybody out there, to include Wall Street and all the analysts, and of course, all of their key business partners, of what they're doing, because of the massive change that it had on their company and how they operated. But they needed to also make sure they're shifting inward, because they're changing their internal processes and systems as they go too. So he really had to navigate how much time we're going to spend looking out there and communicating versus rebuilding ourselves around these new decisive operations. They build the culture in the bench. They came from a very fragmented, almost like a whole holding company, to a very focused company now that was focused on consumer health and hygiene and personal care products. So they had to really rebrand themselves, and that also included rebranding their culture. Who are we? What are we all about? They had to also rebrand and rebuild their bench. There's a whole lot of leaders that came up in these other 100 brands that were very high talent leaders and workers that they wanted to maintain, many of them, but they had to change their knowledge, skills, and their abilities to be able to operate on these two new decisive lines of operation that I showed you. And he talked about he had to spend a lot of time on horizontal and vertical alignment to get everybody aligned around where he's going. And again, he had to do some of that very transactional, and some of it, almost say authoritarianly, but he had to let people know this is where the bus is going. You either get on this bus or you don't. And he made it very clear, we are completely changing the nature of Procter & Gamble. So this is where we're going. Either get it with it, support it, or get off the bus. And of course, he laid out a lot of incentives. He moved all the cheese where it needed to move, right, to get everybody to want to support the actions and behaviors that were required to get everybody there, to create that horizontal vertical alignment where they're going. And then lastly, of course, building capabilities. And I already talked about that with some shaping operations and things that were needed to rebuild the new capability sets to be effective in those areas. All right, so just an example of this. What I'd like to do is break you out here. Lynn, if you could give them 12 minutes in a breakout, please. So we'll put you out in some teams and let you guys talk about this and think about, which functions do you think need the most work in your organizations? And what are some things that you could personally do as a leader at whatever position of the company you're at to help influence the enterprise level? So when you come back, we'll ask for a couple of you to share what you talked about. So Lynn, if you could put the invitation out there, you'll see on your screen a little invite. Just click on accept or whatever the button is. Welcome back, everybody. So if I could just get each room to tell the rest of the group here, just one thing is fine, maybe two if you have it, no more than two for time's sake, of a couple of key points you talked about. So let's start with room one. Andy, Carrie, Shakir, or T. Harris, whoever T is. One of you could share, please.
I'll go ahead. This is Andy. So we had talked about that there happened to be three of us from a legacy within the group, and Shakir was also here from Duke Energy. The three of us with a legacy were able to, we're all in an interesting situation where we're going through a CEO change. So
Right.
This could be a time of a lot of change, and really we looked at focusing. The first thing that popped in my head as far as it related to the P&G example was we do have a lot of offerings. We don't have 165, but we do have a lot of different types of savings vehicles and different types of lending vehicles. And to me, I think that's something that we could examine both from a profitability lens, but also on how it could just streamline us, especially on the operational side. Because a lot of what we have, they're very, very similar, save some minor nuances. And from a member standpoint, it could be overwhelming, especially visually. If they're going through our website, there's so much to choose from that I think that we could scale it down to keep their interest, want to ask some more questions rather than going to a competitor's website. To do that, though, we would really need to also focus on the create horizontal and vertical alignments, because we have a long history and we have quite a few cultural artifacts that I think need to be examined, especially as we're going through a leadership change. We might need to bring some things culturally up to date that can be shared by a very largely new workforce. We have a lot of people that have been around for a long, long time, but we also have a lot of very new people in some key organizational positions also that would really need to share the vision of streamlining what we have to offer. And then lastly, it leads to lead externally, because again, it goes back to the visual. It would be much easier for us to focus on some key products that we have rather than 20 different types of personal loans. Our elevator speech can be brought down to be much more effective. As long as we're hitting on the things that our members are looking for and needing, we can do that in a much more efficient way.
Yeah, great comments, Andy. I really like how we talk about focusing the organization's attentions. That applies not only within, but like you said, outside, right? Stakeholders, customers, when they look at us, do they see our focus? Do they see streamlined capabilities and know what we're really good at, what we're offering, and not just be, overwhelmed, like you said. I also like you brought up this idea about culture change. And it kind of goes back to this explore, exploit too, which you can apply that, of course, to products and services, but also even to your own culture. Like, what part of our culture do we want to maintain and exploit? And what new cultural facets do we want to explore, right? To bring into our culture, to make sure that we're keeping the best of who we are and what we are, changing with the external environment. Great. Let's go to room 2. Kate, Con, Melissa, and the Queen.
Sure, I can debrief us. This is Kate. So we spoke about the reconcile tension component and had 2 different perspectives there. One from 2 businesses that had recently integrated, and then a different situation where there were some failures in the company and taking accountability for those failures. So the tension piece of it being where we may be working with folks where we're not directly managing the people. So we need to influence across, up and down as leaders to be able to resolve or reconcile that tension in those situations.
Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the things, I kind of call it lazy leadership, right? Lots of times when I go into organizations and find that they've got problems with vertical and horizontal alignment, the leaders all talk about why the people below them are not, aligning and everything. But at the end of the day, it's the leaders themselves are not aligned. If you're a vice president of a division and you don't have a strong relationship with the other VPs, and you're not all creating an enterprise mindset where you're all willing to support each other, give and take, and kind of have a one team, one fight mindset, you can never expect the people below you to. It's leaders that the functional, sort of that operational level above have got to get aligned in an enterprise mindset. If you, as you just said, if you don't expect anybody else to. Great. Room 3, Chelsea, Michael, Pam, and G. Thompson.
Hi, this is Chelsea. I'll debrief for our room. So we initially started talking about focus, organizational attention, and kind of this thought of, being a leader within a division that's within a group that's under, this, C-suite leader, and how like almost feeling like not necessarily a little person, but in regards to strategy and mission, when they ask us feedback, like, what does that look like? Like, could they shift from the way, they were operating, as you mentioned, the Procter & Gamble move? Like, could they, just, separate divisions, and what does that look like, and how do we, kind of be a part of that conversation, if our, companies are looking for change. But then we also talked about reconciling tensions as well, especially when it comes to changes. We had mentioned like post-COVID, right? And when we were in the pandemic and how changes had to happen. And now we're shifting back from that. And what does it look like, and how do agencies adapt or companies adapt? But then also too, the onboarding of new generations and what their ideas of employment and how that may differ from our executive leadership or, our C-suite's idea of leadership, and balancing those two to be able to have success.
Yeah, great. And and you're like one of those people I was talking about. It's kind of in the middle, right? You got to be a translator up, a translator down, and that means you got to lead up too. And that's why, again, enterprise leadership is not a role; it's a function, right? And leaders in the middle have got to lead up and help persuade the senior leaders, make sure they understand what's going on and where there's lack of alignment, and give them recommendations on what they can do to help support people at the lower levels better and all that. Well, great. Lastly, let's go to room 4. Brett and Gerson.
So yeah, we kind of had conversations along a couple different avenues. I'm from a legacy as well. Several of my peers are on this call, and so I took it from the lens kind of that more horizontal vertical alignment through 2 lenses. One, obviously, with the new CEO. He wants to come in, not necessarily immediately make all these changes, but learn about our organization. But changes are on the horizon, right? And so when those changes start to be implemented, whether it be culture, strategy, direction, whatever that might be, one, how are we making sure our resources and teams are aligned? But 2, I think a lot about our challenges with that communication and communicating the why behind the decision-making process. We had a cultural survey done not too long ago, and one of the big pain points, you might say, was individuals across the organization did not always feel they were well informed as to why the organization was doing what it was doing. And so making sure that we have leaders who are empowered but engaged in that communication channel. Sometimes I think it's taken for granted that if you have an executive you report to, you're getting a lot of insider information, quote unquote, that you have a good insight into what's happening, and maybe you're taking for granted that that doesn't translate beyond your position or farther down the organization. So we need to be a lot more proactive in that communication. And then also with Carson and Parle, they work for smaller organizations at this time. And one of the themes from this group that seemed to bubble up in my mind was kind of that organizational focus and attention. Along the lines of maybe the strategic decision making, right? Like they're talking about what's next for our organization, how are we going to grow, where's our areas of expertise, or how do we want to grow and move forward? How are we going to shift or change the culture as we have new leadership maybe coming on board, similar to that. So I think there was some dialogue around what is an effective way to really help bring about that change, to bring about good feedback and engagement from a small team. Creating a safe space in which they feel comfortable sharing their thoughts and feedback, and taking ownership for the next iteration and development of your business. And Parle and Carson, please jump in if I missed something or misspoke.
No, it's great. You covered most.
Those are great comments. I mean, one of the things that, as I hear you talk, Brett, one of the important factors of everything we're talking about today with enterprise leadership is, one word I would use is intentionality. You just listed off a lot of things that leaders need to be very intentional about thinking about and changing in their organizations. And one of the best ways to do it, like you said, is to engage with people, and just make sure that everybody feels like they can have a voice, find out what's going on, talk to people. The most important thing I ever did as a senior leader was just live long, leadership by walking around, and just no agenda, just go out and talk to people. Hey, what's going on in your world today? What ideas do you have for the company? What are you struggling with down here? Maybe I could help you. How can you make us better? What are some things that are going on? What do you see that you would love to see me? If I could ask you one thing that I could possibly go and do, what would it be? That type of, just those kind of conversations. It's amazing what people will tell you if you just kind of give them a chance. You get out there and engage with them, and then communicate, as you just said too. To make sure stuff's permeating down the layers of an organization. one of the things like in the Army we call battlefield circulation, but it's basically live walk leadership by walking around, where commanders are all trained to go down 2 levels and talk to people and find out if they understand the leader's intent. So if you can't go down 2 levels, and if I'm a commander and I have commanders underneath me, right, and I go down below them, if those people 2 levels down can't tell me what their leader's intent is for a given plan or project or mission, and what my intent is 2 levels up at the bigger picture, then we got a problem, right? We're not synchronized across levels. If you don't have 2 levels, that's where the magic happens, right? So that way everybody knows, hey, this is what our team's doing, but here's what our team is doing within the next higher level, picture. So anyways, great stuff. Thanks for all the comments and everything. Let me just close out because we just got a couple of minutes left here to talk about, of course, one of the key takeaways from all this is where we spend our time, and you got to ask yourself, if you look at like your meeting agendas, and you're all at different levels of organizations, and so some of you are at higher levels, you probably ought to have a little bit more of your agendas around these types of things. But, you got to ask yourself how much should be, right? And are we truly spending enough time thinking about these big picture things for the organization, how either we can affect them or how we can lead up to influence the influencers above us who can enact these 6 functions. The other thing is, where you spend your time is what gets done. And this is more for an individual level here, for you as individuals. But I call this the leader focus grid. And it's just a way to try to get people to think about where they spend their time. Because you can spend your time down at the tactical level, the operational, or up top, more toward that strategic or enterprise. And you can spend a lot of time managing your organizations or spending more time leading your organizations. And so this kind of creates this natural 2x2 grid. As it says there on the slide, the small print in each of the squares are just examples. I'm not trying to say those are all the activities. They're just there to kind of help illuminate which each quadrant, types of things they may involve. But I would invite all of you to some time, maybe this week, have a couple of Shirley Temples or whatever you're into, and put your feet up and really just kind of say, hey, really, where do I spend my time? Maybe even do a more formal time audit for a month and see where you spend your time. Because what where you spend your time is what gets done. And probably even, very importantly to you also is your brand. When people are sitting around the water cooler talking about you, when they think about, hey, who is this person? What are their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and what are their personal priorities? They're going to base that off of where they see you spend your time. And if you're spending your time down the lower left on tactical management most of the time, they're probably going to use words like, oh, they're a great executor, right, or whatever, great performer, volume. But they're not necessarily going to call you a strategic, leader, strategic thinker, a transformational leader, a visionary, or whatever. And again, these aren't the words necessarily they will use, but people are using words about you around the water cooler, right? And in meetings where they're talking about who to promote, who are our next high potential leaders. Well, if they haven't seen you spending time and effort and talking strategically and, transformationally and all that, they're obviously not going to brand you in those kind of ways. So think about where you spend your time, because that's what it gets done, but it's also, where your focus is and where you brand yourself as a leader. So anyways, do a time audit. It's really important. Every time I coach a senior leader, I have them do this, and it blows them away when they really see for a month, where they really spent their time. All right, well, I think our time's over here, so I'm going to turn it back over, I think, to Stacy. And thanks for attending, everybody, today. I know this was kind of short, but we'll send you the reading, and you could dive a little bit deeper into it if you choose. So, Stacy, over to you.
Sure. Sean, thanks so much for your insights. I think what you're talking about is applicable to anybody, which you mentioned earlier on. No matter what your role is, these are things that are helpful to you at work. Thanks to all of our participants. We'll follow up with additional information and the recording later this afternoon. Have a great day, everyone.